Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander. And as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to be returning to one of our favorite subjects, yours and mine alike, taking a break from Donald Trump and geopolitics, and we're going back to the media. In particular, we're going to be focusing on CGTN. Now, if that acronym doesn't sound familiar to you, it's because there's recently been a name change in the world of Chinese media. It used to be known as CCTV, which was China Central Television. Many of you may know that because there's CCTV America, CCTV Africa, there's CCTV World, all of these CCTVs around the world. Now, the Chinese would like you to think that this is their equivalent of the BBC or Al Jazeera. But now they are known as CGTN, China Global Television News. And it's the same thing, just a different brand. But they're very different animals than Al Jazeera and BBC, in part because unlike those broadcasters, which are state-owned, but not always state-controlled. So, for example, VOA, which is managed by the Broadcasting Board of Governors of the United States, is definitely state-owned and increasingly state-controlled. The BBC has a very kind of distant relationship from the state, even though it's funded mostly by license fees and taxes. But in China, it's a little bit different because it's actually not even state-owned. Media in China is party-controlled by the Communist Party, which is the supreme political power in China. The state is actually an entity of the party or a subset of the party in the power dynamic. And media falls under party control. So really, in one very important sense here, this is a different animal than what we see with other state broadcasters around the world. And Cobus, I don't think that important subtlety is actually very well known.
Yes, there's a second important subtlety that's also important to keep in mind. That is that on the one hand, CGTN, which I can never keep that straight, but it does operate as the voice of China in the outside world and in Africa particularly, very strongly. However, it is also trying to compete in the international news ecosystem. So it is competing in the same market as the BBC, as CNN, and Al Jazeera. So it has a kind of a hybrid job to do where it is both representing the state or the party and having to actually do a news and reporting service work.
Now, here's what's very interesting, and we're going to talk about this with our guest coming up. You know, I've been a China nerd now for 30 years, and for a long time I used to live in the United States, and CGTN or CCTV, whatever you want to call it, has amazing distribution in the United States on many of the cable carriers, Time Warner Cable, Comcast, DirecTV, albeit it's on the digital platform and it's a little bit high up. But it's painful to watch, and I never watched it, and I never, ever met anybody who watched it. We had your colleague, Cobus, Bob Wakesa, who's done a lot of research on CCTV. We had him on the show a couple years ago, and one of the questions I asked him was, have you ever met anybody who's actually watched this thing? And he would say, yes, there is. But when you say, Cobus, that they're competing with CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera, those channels have a lot of viewers. Now, there is no audience data for these international networks because there's no ratings for Botswana. There's no ratings for, South Sudan. So the TV networks use these kind of false metrics to show how popular they are by saying how many homes they are distributed in. And so they say we're available in 150 million homes, throughout Africa or around the world. And that doesn't actually tell you how many people are actually watching. But today we're not going to talk about what CCTV creates in terms of content and whether people are watching or the business model or whatnot. Today, for the first time, we're actually going to go inside CGTN. And this is really, a very rare and unique opportunity to understand the inner workings of a Chinese media entity, in part because, the Chinese are not very well known for letting Westerners or anybody in, particularly researchers or journalists, to better understand how they do things. And so we are thrilled to have back on the show somebody who we've had on I'd say about 2 years ago almost now, Melissa. Melissa Lefkowitz is a doctoral student in New York University's PhD program. She's pursuing her degree in sociocultural anthropology, where she's doing research on young Chinese living and working in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome back to the program, Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric and Cobus. It's great to be here.
Cobus? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Everybody. PhD program. She's pursuing her degree in sociocultural anthropology, where she's doing research on young Chinese living and working in Nairobi, Kenya. Melissa, welcome back to the show. We had you on, I think, about a year and a half ago for a documentary that you did in southern China. Is that correct?
That is correct. And you had me on twice, actually, that year, which was fun.
That's right. So we're thrilled to have you back. Now you've done this kind of, I'm not going to call it an expose because I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, but a research project that looked inside the management and the operation of the CGTN. Tell us a little bit about kind of what was the inspiration for the project and kind of give us the big 30,000 foot kind of overview of it.
So basically I had done my master's thesis looking at the, back in 2012 on the visual representation of Africans in Chinese mass media from the Mao era to the present. And basically it definitely had to leapfrog because I would say that like there was a lot during the Mao era and then not a lot in like the 80s and 90s and then like a lot after FOCAC kind of thing post 2000. But when I left that project, I felt like that was just when CCTV Africa, which it was called, at the time, was launching in Nairobi. And I felt like the next step to this is really to understand how the imaginary of Africa is being co-produced by both Chinese social actors and Kenyan social actors or, professionals. And that was really the inspiration for the project. And I just really wanted to get in there and see what was going on. And it turned out the project to be less about the images that were being produced and about the ways that they were being produced and sort of the tone of the production and why people were there. Like just it became something else. It began as something and it morphed, as research usually does, right?
So you made the interesting point that there's actually quite a lot of research about CCTV in Africa, but that most of it comes from either international relations or media studies perspectives, and that you felt that you needed to actually be on the ground and actually interact with the actual people in the office. Why did you feel that, and what did you gain by actually being there?
It's a great question. I guess what I felt with the IR work is that they kind of start with their answer, which is like, this is soft power kind of thing. And, I'm kind of interested in the idea, I guess, of soft power. I think the term is used way too often, but like, it's not to say that isn't like a good category to like inquire into. And, but that's sort of what the end is. That's the telos of it. And then the media studies work, I guess, is really diverse, and there's so much good stuff going on. Giovanna Pippin actually just sent me a great article that she wrote, and I met a lot of people who are working on these really excellent analyses. But what I think is missing sometimes is that it becomes very divorced from kind of the work that goes into making the work. And it sometimes when you kind of are just looking at these images, you can kind of you kind of can put all the authorship onto this state media outlet called CCTV Africa, but really kind of who these authors are and kind of what the mission is, I had a sense was much more muddled. And so I just really wanted to get in there and just to really kind of know what that messiness was.
You wanted to get to the human side of the story. Who are the people in their stories, kind of who, all these people coming together. Let me just for the benefit of our listeners, give a little bit of background on what you did there. You spent 2 months in Nairobi, and they gave you access for 2 months. So you weren't a covert kind of undercover employee, trying to report on this. And it's a little surprising to me, to be honest with you, because Chinese companies, much less state-owned or party-owned companies, are typically not that welcoming of foreign researchers. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But you interviewed 11 employees from throughout the organization, 7 Kenyans, 2 British, 1 South African, 1 Chinese. But the most telling point about, your whole study was that it didn't include very many Chinese perspectives, particularly from the management. Why was that?
Right. Well, because the day one of research, I was told, and we will not be going on record for your research. It's really as simple as that.
Which is ironic in a news organization, of course, of all places, that they won't go on record to talk about what they're doing. I mean, it's
Exactly.
just the hypocrisy.
We are journalists, and we will not be talking to you. So it's really, and there were, I mean, such kind people though that I met, like who are, of course, Chinese, and as you read, you know, like the managers, you know, that whole level, like it, you know, is comprised of Chinese, I guess,
so
media professionals.
The senior executives, right?
Yeah, well, the senior executives, but then it's like the supervisors too. Like there were Kenyan journalists who were, or I guess I'm trying to think about the right, like they're Kenyan media professionals, because not everyone's a journalist, you know, who have supervisory roles. But every section of CCTV Africa, like there's like the news section, or I guess I'm trying to think about each section, but every section has to have a Chinese professional overseeing that area.
Yeah, but to be fair here, though, I've spent 25 years in journalism at France 24, BBC, AP, CNN, you know, the alphabet soup of international news.
Sure.
And my last job at France 24, you know, I was the editor-in-chief of the digital division, and I was a foreigner. I spoke fluent French. I write fluent French, but I was still a foreigner. And I didn't survive very long. It was about a year. And that's all run by French. I don't think there are senior foreigners in the senior executive leadership of the BBC. I know that Al Jazeera has become far more Arabic now. So I'm not sure that that's that unusual now with state and party-owned broadcasters.
Yeah. No, and I find, and that's really kind of the take that I have on this, is that I'm not interested in sort of exceptionalizing CCTV either. I'm very interested in, you know, it's something I was pointing out, but not making value judgments about. And I think what's very important, you know, about work like this is that if somebody reads this, they go and they do some more comparative work, you know. But I do think that it's, I think that it was slightly problematic though. And I think it's probably problematic in every organization, probably, to kind of have that association between national belonging and power with regard to hierarchy. But I'm not trying to say that it's exceptional necessarily.
What's very interesting for me in all of that is the role of the African journalists themselves. And, you know, your research seems to show that it's not a uniform experience, and there's, you know, some seem relatively happy, but there's a lot of caveats there, and they seem to be working under quite complex circumstances. I wonder if you could like unpack like what the experience is like to be a Kenyan journalist at CCTV.
Totally, and that was I think when you're doing research, you're kind of, at least for me, right? I think, well, everyone, I guess, approaches a research in a different way. What I always find hard is when you kind of want everyone to be saying the same thing almost, because that would then help you find a pattern, but you go somewhere and you find that people are individuals and they're saying different things, and then you have to sort of figure it out from there. And what I found entering is that there were many people who were Kenyan, whom I interviewed, who were just so happy to be there. They're for just different reasons. I mean, one was like, you know, so a lot of these guys, like, so out of the 9 Kenyans that I interviewed, or let's see, sorry.
7.
No, out of the 7 Kenyan nationals I interviewed, 6 had experience working in Kenyan media outlets. So what that basically meant is that people had been working either at Kenyan television network, KTN, NTV, which is Nation TV, and Citizen TV. And those are domestic media outlets, and people were very happy to be out of them who were enjoying their time at CCTV Africa. And they cited, you know, many reasons that are quite relatable, like they were working hours that were too long, their roles weren't very well demarcated. What maybe is perhaps the most important piece of this is that the technology wasn't up to date. And what's different about CCTV Africa was that their hours were known, their roles were known, and they had everything that they needed to get their jobs done. And so that was very important to people who were both creating content and who weren't creating content, like the guys who just, were working in the broadcast, room behind the scenes, and kind of just making sure that everything was going smoothly, right? Those guys were very pleased to have everything up to date, 21st century kind of. I mean, that's how they said it to me, right? So I was struck by that. And then the people who weren't as satisfied, they had their own reasons, but they also had a certain amount of pragmatism that I also found surprising. Like, many people I talked to weren't surprised that a state media outlet would enforce certain types of censorship, because of course it's a state media outlet and that's what you do. And that was just obvious to them. And that was really interesting to hear.
Let's pick up on this censorship question, because one of the most interesting quotes that you bring up was, and I'll read this. He said, one of the employees, and I don't remember who it was, what nationality, but he or she said, we're not very nuanced in our coverage of China-specific issues. And that came as a surprise to this employee, because they feel a little bit that they were kind of hoodwinked, that they came into this big international news organization and they thought they were going to be able to cover the world as a proper journalist. And then they run smack head into, what the real purpose of CGTN is, or CCTV, is that it is to kind of be the voice of China, the voice of the Communist Party of China. Yeah. And this brings up this interesting challenge that Chinese media have. The Chinese spend billions of dollars every year on propaganda. Interestingly, in China, the word propaganda and censorship, those two words, are not bad words. Right. Where I come from, the United States, those are terrible words, propaganda and censorship. But in China, those are just part of the vernacular. But it does highlight this very interesting contradiction. And it's the same contradiction that's playing out in the film industry, because the film industry is a very, very important business now for the Chinese, and they want to export their movies around the world. But you brought up this question of soft power. And on the one hand, the United States is extremely effective in soft power through its news and its movies and its TV. And yet the Chinese aren't doing it. And I would listen to a podcast this week hosted by Bonnie Glaser of the China Power Project. If you haven't checked out that podcast and you're interested in anything China, she is the bomb, and it's great. And this week she interviewed an old professor of mine, actually, Stanley Rosen of the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, who was commenting on the film business. So again, this is about the film business, but there are some striking parallels to the TV business and the work that Melissa did at CGTN. Let's take a listen.
One of the reasons, ironically, again, why the U.S. is so strong and China is so weak is that Hollywood films are completely separate from the American government. You can hate the American government because of its foreign policy. You can hate Donald Trump or anybody, but you can still enjoy, even the jihadis enjoy Hollywood films. Whereas in the case of China, its soft power based on film is so weak because soft power is inseparable in China from government actions. So no matter what kind of films they try to promote, if the Chinese do something in the South China Sea or in Tibet or in Xinjiang or over Taiwan that people don't like, it inevitably hurts its soft power because people don't see a real separation there. So certainly China cares a great deal about image and branding. They spend over $10 billion a year on promoting soft power. They want not just the domestic audience for their films, but the international audience. They promote propaganda films at home with socialist core values. The problem with China is, in terms of soft power and many other things, is that there are a lot of contradictions in their policies. In other words, if you look at what the head of propaganda, now called publicity in China, says, we want our films to have control as much as possible of our domestic market, certainly more than 50%. That's a politically determined figure, 50%. And we also want to have our films successful overseas, to kind of sell China, to make people like China. But at the same time, he says they have to have socialist core values. Well, if you try to make films with socialist core values, not only will they have no international market, but they'll have very little domestic market as well. So they're faced with that dilemma.
So, Melissa, I get the sense that that same contradiction is at play at CGTN, where on the one hand, they want to have socialist core values, which is to promote propaganda of the Chinese state party and whatnot and their role in Africa. But on the other hand, they're trying to present themselves as a competitor to Al Jazeera and, really being very, very, relevant in people's lives. Did you pick up on that kind of tension in the newsroom and within the organization at CGTN in Nairobi?
Yeah, well, so I definitely did not pick up on it in the newsroom. Everyone's very collegial, and if there's a problem, like, I wasn't able to see it. And that's kind of important to note, because from a research perspective, like, just doing participant observation really wasn't enough, because people are going to sort of operate in a very specific way, in a specific environment. So when I got, off-site and at a cafe with one of these journalists, I talked to news anchors and I talked to people who were producers and things like that. I was able to hear that there was this frustration at having been told, see, another tagline, again, for CCTV Africa was like, African news for African people, right? So it was supposed to be this alternative to BBC or Al Jazeera, who are doing African news for their publics. And so you have these guys coming in who are thinking that they're going to be able to cover whatever they want, and then they start writing and they find that there's red ink all over their work. And I think, there was definitely. That was the complexity of it. Some people said, "Oh, I could really write what I want and do what I want," and then others said, "Really, we can't, and it's a problem. And why aren't we? Why? Yeah." And I mean,
Yeah.
I had some really interesting ethnographic experiences where I was
Sure.
Yeah.
So Cobus, I'd like to get your take on it, because you're a media scholar in Africa, and I think it'd be helpful for people listening to this show to kind of hear what socialist core values actually sounds like. So if you've never listened or watched Chinese kind of state-controlled media, this is a clip that I picked up just today, and I just went onto YouTube and and said, okay, let me find one clip from a news broadcast from one of the African broadcasts of CGTN, and it'll give you a flavor of a lot of the news that they do.
Well, China and South Sudan do indeed have a history of friendship and cooperation since the African country gained its independence in 2011. CGTN's Susan Mwongeli takes a look at those ties.
In February this year, China and South Sudan agreed to boost cooperation in the health sector. That includes enhanced knowledge sharing, capacity building, and hospital-to-hospital collaboration. The deal will allow Chinese health specialists to set up experimental operations and management units in the East African nation.
It's just painful to listen to. I mean,
I can actually feel myself sinking under the desk.
I mean, it's not news, okay? And this is where, and I feel bad, because I know I have several friends who work for CCTV America and CGTN America, and even one friend at CGTN in Nairobi. And I don't mean to undermine what they're doing, but it's just not news. This is party propaganda. And you can feel the party apparatchiks kind of writing this in Beijing and kind of distributing it out to the rest of the world. So,
I kind of want to push against that a little bit, though.
Okay, go.
So I think that so what I found from the journalists, and this is partially why I think that they were conflicted, is that if they had to cover, they actually thought that they could do more when there was content that wasn't directly related to China. Like, they had more breadth, actually. And this is something I heard both from people who were, not everyone had experience in other places, but there was a British reporter who said that she had worked for France 24 and other places. And she had said that actually she was positive that they were able to cover more news from the African continent than other international media outlets, and that was invigorating for her. But on the Kenyan end, and on the Kenyan end, not like as a, counterpoint to this, there was also this sense of, well, if we're covering something that doesn't, of course, everything kind of connects back to China, right? Because you have to understand, like, of course, these Chinese producers are choosing these stories for a reason, whatever. But there were times when they were able to cover pieces in ways that they wanted to cover pieces, and they felt like they wouldn't get a lot of reading, just like, one word that they didn't know was a forbidden word would be crossed out or something. It was really these stories like that had to do with like the South China Sea or something like that, where, their stories would just get obliterated. There's an example in the paper of kind of trying to cover the South China Sea's dispute and not getting any clips from The Hague, nothing about what the arbitration said, nothing from the Philippines after the UNCLOS arbitration decision came out. And they only had Xi Jinping and a soundbite from the Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And that was given to me as an example of how bad it can get. But it was not an example of how it is all the time. And so I just want to kind of put that out there, that people aren't there to just kind of push out things they hate. I think that some people are very committed and have a sense of what it means to do journalism and felt that they could sometimes do the work that they wanted to do.
And I think it's also, from their perspective, or I'm guessing, as someone who's worked, myself has worked in African state-owned broadcasting in South Africa, that's not that surprising, I think, for someone who comes out of state broadcasting in Africa to see that kind of one-sided coverage. It's depressing, and no one wants to do it. But I think kind of people are very used to seeing that in African journalism as well. So it might well be also that they kind of, it's not such a like blinding surprise to them as it maybe would have been to other journalists from other countries.
Well,
exactly. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No. Just very quickly, just to going back to my own experience at CNN, France 24, and other newsrooms, and here in Vietnam, where I used to run a newsroom as well, I think people in the West get a little sanctimonious about censorship in other parts of the world. And, what I've learned is that in places like Vietnam and China, the censorship is political. At France 24, the censorship that I ran into was cultural. So there was distinct biases towards Francophone Africa, even though there were much better news stories in Anglophone or Arab-speaking Africa. And they would allocate resources disproportionately to French-speaking Africa because, well, they speak French, and that's what France is supposed to do, is to extend its influence of France 24 to French-speaking Africa. That was happening all the time. And so to me, the end of the day, a bias is the equivalent of censorship. And in the United States, at CNN and other places, it's a corporate censorship. You don't insult your advertisers. There are, if you watch local news in the United States, there will never be an investigation of the used car business because they're one of the biggest advertisers on local TV news. At CNN, we never did any investigations of the tobacco industry until Congress picked up the issue first, and it was safe because Kraft at that time, which owned RJR Reynolds, was one of the largest advertisers on Turner Broadcasting. So censorship materializes in different ways, but at the end of the day, you are adjusting your content based on an external force, whatever that may be, cultural, political. My frustration, though, is the hypocrisy that comes out of it, where CCTV pretends that it is covering the world, and CCTV Africa positions itself as a kind of combination of China and Africa together, and yet you don't see any coverage of the Ivory issue, of Chinese corruption, of Sampa, of all these these wonderful stories about Chinese illegal logging. That would be very interesting. That's why people would turn to CCTV. But of course, you will never see that on CCTV because its primary purpose is not to inform, but it's about propaganda. And I use that in the worst sense of the word, not in the Chinese positive sense of the word. What's your reaction?
Well, I agree. And I think that just kind of going back to the pragmatism piece, which I picked up on earlier, I just want to kind of give a bit of a sense of the context in Nairobi, which is that the domestic media outlets there it's very well known that they're run by people who are very closely affiliated with specific political parties, if not parties, then leaders. And many people know, for instance, that Arap Moi was, connected to one of the state networks and things like that. So there was like this kind of bias toward Kalenjin related interests. And so people were coming out of a environment where it was already known that, biases would be created based on certain types of affinities, political mostly. So I just wanted to put that out there. But the hypocrisy piece, I think it's very, very, very frustrating. It's like, why can't you say, hey, this is news for us. We're actually here to promote our interests. And so thank you for coming on board. And thank you for also watching.
No. You'd be terrible in marketing. Melissa, you have no future in marketing whatsoever. I mean, that's, stick with that.
It's such a painful thing to sort of say that you're going but it's also painful to our ears, right? And I think we have to remember, this is my anthropological side. It's like, to our ears, it's painful, but to what extent, again, as I was saying with my interlocutors, sometimes doing the work was very difficult, but there was a pragmatism there. And I'm not sure what it would be like for someone who's completely embedded in a Chinese media world, because
yeah. I mean, I've been I was embedded 4 years in a Vietnamese media world, which is very similar in terms of kind of the censorship and the control. But the thing that gave me sustenance was that a lot of people were watching my shows and the programs that we produced. And again, Cobus, this to me is I think would be far more demoralizing, is not that the Chinese censor their news, because yes, everybody for the most part there's very few forms of pure information and news. Less so today in our confirmation bias, Facebook fueled world that we live in. But I guess my bigger problem is the fact that it's a lie that a lot of people are watching this, because nobody's watching this. Melissa, in your research, did you find anybody? Cobus, did you find anybody who's watching this stuff?
Okay, I didn't do audience tallies, but just anecdotally in teaching on CGTN for a long time, I frequently ask my students, who all have satellite TV, which carries two CGTN channels in South Africa. I always ask them, who watches it regularly? No one does ever. Who has ever watched it? Frequently, no one. Even then, no one raises their hand. So, generally, I would assume it's not very popular. But yeah, again, we don't know.
That to me is the more demoralizing point.
I have a sense of this a little bit because I was staying in an apartment with two Kenyan women, and we would watch DSTV together. DSTV, I guess, is one of the cable providers, right? So they had
the big South African company.
Yes, and so we would watch television through that service, and I would turn to CCTV Africa because it was interesting to me for my research, but ethnographically, it was interesting to see what people were watching, and no one would ever turn to CCTV Africa. I mean, it is so not even on someone's radar as like something to flip to.
And it just doesn't. No, but see, Cobus, you bring up the good point. It's boring. And I think if you watch African news, I mean, particularly Nigerian news and even Kenyan news, it's a lot more salacious. It's a lot more fast paced. It's a lot more kind of, the tempo is faster, and the pace of CGTN is just like, it's again like that clip we were listening to. You just want to go to sleep. Let's go to your conclusions here. And I'm about to insult you, but I don't mean to. It's actually going to come as a compliment, Melissa. So bear with me. Three conclusions here. Security protocols for more reporting in the field. That was one conclusion that you had. They want to improve interpersonal relationships. and the employees want more professional training. So in your conclusion, those were the three kind of action items that you picked up on. And the reason I'm going to, it may come off sounding like an insult, is like, those are pretty unremarkable conclusions. And I think that's very interesting in one sense. And it comes back to the earlier part of our conversation that the human issues going on at CCTV, never mind the politics and the content and the soft powers we talked about, but the human issues and the management and the leadership issues, to me, as a kind of veteran of this business, seem quite unremarkable, very typical. In fact, I think you could go to 25 newsrooms around the world and you would find exactly those same three conclusions.
Completely. And I think something one of my professors told me recently, because it is it's tough when you go somewhere and you're like, oh, where's this big meaty thing I was looking for they didn't get? And she said, negative data is data too. And it's a really important point to think like, oh, I've seen this before, this isn't anything. It's like, no, if you've seen this before, it's something. You just have to think about what it is. And I think it's that the fact that CCTV Africa is somehow like something else is very important, because so much of the work, not the good work, not the good, I would say that there's a bifurcation between good and bad work in China and Africa, but some of the not so remarkable work in China and Africa really wants to exceptionalize China. And I think more work needs to be done to sort of situate some of these institutions within fields. And so one field could be like the international media news, media broadcasting, sector in Nairobi, Kenya, for instance, and to do comparative work and to see the extent to which CCTV Africa is like or isn't like. But the thing is that people are working there, and you'll see also my conclusion, are staying for years and aren't leaving. And of course, there's also the problem that BBC isn't hiring enough Black Africans to work for them. But there's also the other issue that people are finding that it's better to work there than for domestic outlets, according to them, or that working for CCTV Index is something international that they want career-wise or something like that, as opposed to domestic. So I think we need to situate CCTV Africa in the field that it is also in. And you're also mentioning, like, more than just in Nairobi, like it can be situated within international media outlet, like more globalized sector, or industry.
It's a job. I mean, and I know a lot of people at CNN in Atlanta and at France 24 in Paris who are miserable about, their job, but there's not a lot of jobs in international media and international news. So people stay, and particularly in places like Nairobi. The paper is Chinese Media, Kenyan Lives, an ethnographic inquiry into CCTV Africa's head office. Of course, it's now CGTN. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Eric and Cobus. It's been great.
And Cobus, boy, this was right up your alley today in media studies. And I'm just, I don't mean to insult anybody who works at CCTV or CGTN. That's not my intention at all. I may have lost a couple friends after this show. But it is a complicated issue. It is one where the content does fall into a very complex matrix of information, news, propaganda, social media, kind of our expectations of news as well.
Yeah, definitely. And, audience pleasure is a very important part of that. And it's very interesting, the effect that we see once audience pleasure falls out of the news equation, and it's something that I think Chinese media needs to pay attention to.
Well, we'd love to hear what your opinions are. Do you watch CGTN, CCTV Africa? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you think it's good? You kind of heard what we have to think, particularly me, on this subject. But I'd like to hear what you have to think. We have some great social media, platforms that you can engage the discussion on. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm closing in on 200,000 followers. Cobus, it's mind-boggling. 200,000 followers on LinkedIn. We've got 236,000 followers over on our Facebook page at facebook.com/China Africa Project. By the way, if you don't want to kind of get too far in the mud on China, Africa, every day on social media, we have a fantastic newsletter that we send out every Monday. And in fact, last week's newsletter included Melissa's paper from the China Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. We send out 5 articles plus a great paper like from people from Melissa. So it's a good way to stay on top of the issues without going in too deep. So you can you can sign up there on our website and over on our Facebook page at facebook.com/China Africa Project. And of course, if you want to follow this podcast, the best way to do it, go to your favorite podcast store, just search for China Africa, and we'll come up. And Cobus, a big month for us. We broke a record, 25,000 downloads last month in February. So the show is getting wider distribution. We're very excited. We want to thank everybody for listening. Coming up in a future episode, we are overdue to do this because we have a lot of new listeners and followers, and people have been asking us about us. And in fact, we've been accused, Melissa, you'll get a kick out of this, of being Chinese propaganda ourselves. So we're going to answer that question coming up in a future edition of the show. But until then, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast.